My name is Ibifunke Igba. I'm a higher surgical trainee in the east of Scotland, Dinny, and today we're going to be talking about making the most of your training. Okay, so this is what we're going to talk about. We'll talk about celebrating the fact that you've got a training number, controlling the narrative about yourself, defining your goals for training, finding your own niche, how to network, appraisals, leave or time out of program, what to do when things go wrong, and planning for post CCT. We'll also talk about the events and how the community can support you in your program. So I'll just look again to see if I have any of the chat about where you're joining from and where you are. Not yet. Okay, that's fine. So celebrate. The most important thing to think about in this situation is the fact that you've got a training number, and that is a big deal. Whether you're UK trained or internationally trained, getting into a postgraduate training program anywhere in the world is competitive. And if you've succeeded in getting yourself a training opportunity, then you should take time out to celebrate that in a way that is worthy of remembering. So take time out to celebrate, and it's going to become, after you get the number, it's going to become a bit chaotic with trying to sort out things for the next phase of your life. So it's really important that you just pause and celebrate this achievement before you start looking to the next thing. My experience was a bit different because after I got my number, I hadn't passed the exam that was a prerequisite for taking up that number. So it was very stressful. And by the time I passed the exam, it was time to move and it was even more stressful. So I didn't really get the time I would have liked to celebrate, which is why I'm strongly recommending that you just pause and celebrate because this is a big achievement. Okay. So we'll move on. And if you're just joining, I was asking if people could say what part of the country they're in, what training program, and what level. So I can tailor the discussion to meet you where you are. Right. So once you've celebrated, then comes the reality of things. You have to plan relocation. If you're lucky, then you'll get a number in the same location where you are, and that keeps things simple. But for most people, you're going to have to move. I've done a blog post about planning your relocation because I think that that's a very big thing. So planning this, you have to think about things like, are you moving on your own or are you moving with family? If you're moving with family, then you have to think what level, what stage your children are at, or if your spouse is working, if they're not going to work. It's a whole big thing. And I'd recommend sitting down and actually thinking about what you want to do, what you want to achieve, the cost of living, where you're moving to, how you're going to cope. If you have a family that's settled in one location and your training program is the sort where you move around a lot, then it might be worthwhile to leave your family where they are and commute for a short period until you're more stable. So it's really useful to start to think about things like that. Okay. Um, Finances, we've talked a bit about that, but so when you think about the finances, you're not thinking just about the move, you're thinking about starting in your new place. How are you going to navigate the change, the transition? So I'll give an easy example. When we moved from England, where I lived, the rent when we moved to Dundee, the rent in Dundee was 2.5 times the cost of the rent in Grimsby. So planning your finances when you're picking, say, where you're going to live, that transition. But it's important to know that there's some DINRI's locations where you'll be offered relocation expenses. So you must always ask the question, and ask the question very early. So for me, I had asked, but the person I asked didn't give me the right answer. Talking about relocating and the financial implications of it. So some trusts will offer you the opportunity to cover the costs of your relocation. So make sure you ask the question because they don't always tell you. And then when you ask, always make sure that the person that is you're asking is answering. Like if you don't get the answer that you think you should be getting, then ask again. And then once you've got that answer, you can then proceed to getting things sorted. Now, when you're starting in the new place, it would be very good if you can to go to meet your colleagues beforehand. So relationships So once you've introduced yourself, it makes it easier for you because when you come in, you're not a new person that doesn't know anyone. You've met a few people. Relationships when you're starting, it's very important to be mindful of creating relationships. So one of the challenges I had in previous ones and when I was starting my training was I was so eager to make friends and I thought first impressions mattered and things like this. But I think it's important to know who you are and know your place in the world. And that way you're not trying too hard. You're just presenting yourself as yourself. And that should be enough to get you through. They're going to have to navigate a bit and you're going to have to sort of not necessarily, you don't have to change your personality, but you have to be wise about what you are projecting. And we'll talk about that shortly. So this is what I mean, controlling the narrative. And I was very glad when I was creating these slides and this picture came up because it's a mask, right? And sometimes you have to put on a mask. So sometimes people are saying things or doing things that are making you feel very uncomfortable. But for the time being, whilst you get a hold of your emotions so that you're not reactive, you put the mask on until you know how you're going to navigate that situation. The other thing about controlling the narrative is that we have to be aware that we can create what we want, how we want people to think about us. So in much the same way as you dress a certain way and you present yourself in a certain way so that you're spoken to in a certain way, and that's the same way with training because all your trainers they're watching you. They've seen other trainees before you, they'll see other trainees after you, and they want to make impressions about you. They want to have discussions and say they know this person, they know this, they know that, or they've seen how hardworking you are, you're reliable, things like that. So it's really important to know that you are the one controlling the narrative, and we'll talk about a few points about that. So what is your identity? How do you want to be identified? Think about that. Most of us we identify with the narrative of I'm hardworking. But hard work is not necessarily going to be enough for you. You have to work hard and work smart. Now, if you've got a family, you have to work twice as hard almost and twice as smart because you are not going to be as available as someone who or you're not going to be perceived to be as available as someone who doesn't have a family. And on the flip side, you'll see people complaining, especially on social media, about the fact that just because they don't have a family, rota coordinators and managers have taken advantage of them, asking them to do things that they wouldn't ask people that have families to do. So it's a balance. What image do you want to project? So if your physical appearance is not projecting confidence, is projecting almost a self-neglect, then you're going to get people who treat you in a way that you will not necessarily appreciate. And this I can share from you have to be mindful of how you look, how you present yourself, how you project yourself. If you have afro hair, if you're carrying your natural hair, be mindful of how you're presenting that. If you're using wigs, be mindful of how you're presenting the wigs. If you have a beard, what's your beard looking like? Is it tidy and trimmed? What's your hair? Like these things shouldn't matter, but they do. Because remember, we're already on a different pedestal in comparison to our peers who have been trained in the UK. The other thing to think about is how are you presenting yourself in terms of your knowledge? And this is your knowledge of clinical situations and your knowledge in terms of the hospital system. Now, week one, when you're saying, oh, I don't know where this is, I don't know where that is, week one, it's fine. Everyone expects during the changeover, the start, the transition, for you to stumble and not be quite sure. But by the time you finish that first week, you're entering your second week, your third week, and you're still looking clueless, then you start to lose the empathy because people want someone who can start and hit the ground running. So you have to think about that. You have to be paying attention. If you must, make notes so that you know, like once you've learned something, you know that you're not going to have to be taught that thing again. In terms of your clinical knowledge, regardless of how much background you have in that specialty, regardless of what you've achieved in life, you're still going to find that there are things you don't know. And that's why you're in a training program. So, first of all, be humble. Be humble enough to acknowledge that there are things that you do not know. Now, when you're with your trainers or other registrars, everybody has different levels of experience. So you might be a very experienced trainee who's relocated to the UK and decided to go via a training program. When you're with your trainers, do not make them feel incompetent because you feel more knowledgeable about something that they're doing. People respond to the way you make them feel, and people say things like people will forget what you said, but they'll remember how you made them feel. So it's important that you are mindful and you manage that with wisdom if you're more knowledgeable. If you feel like you don't have the knowledge, you're not there yet, and you're feeling overwhelmed, then you have to double up on the work. You are going to be learning all the time. So you have to treat it as more than a job. It's not just something you show up to and you learn just like the skill or whatever, and you do the job and that's it, done. It's something that you're doing, you're learning, it's postgraduate education. So you have to be serious about that learning process. You have to be studying, you have to be assessing yourself, and you're going to be heading towards exams at some point. So you have to focus on that and be aware of that. In your communication, you have to be, I don't want to say sensible, but sensible is a good word. So when you're communicating with patients, with staff, you have to be aware that people are going to talk about the way you communicate. So whether your trainers are present or not, be mindful that you're being observed. So it's almost like you're perpetually in an OSCE situation. So when you speak to patients, speak to them as you would in an OSCE situation, because that's the professionalism. That's why those things are built into the OSCE exams, because presumably once you've passed those clinical exams, the assumption is that you've had the training of how to speak professionally to your patients. So make that a habit, not just something you do for exams. When it comes to communicating with your peers, it's important to be cordial but assertive. Don't let people take you for granted. At the same time, don't be pushy or rude. Be very mindful of gossip. Gossip is a currency in the NHS. It's the currency by which people buy affection and buy allegiance. So if you're not contributing to gossip, then you might find that you're poor in the economy of gossip. It's important to find balance. So you may not necessarily contribute negatively to gossip, but you may also be able to engage in the conversations without saying things that people can pick on and say that you said this or you said that, if that makes sense. I'll give you an example. I find this new person very rude. Oh, do you? Why have you said that? In this way, I haven't shut down the conversation. I've allowed the person to speak. And when they've spoken, I'll say, that's really interesting. I have to see what happens when next I speak with them. I haven't really had that much to say to them so far. So I've engaged in the conversation, but I haven't said, oh, me too, the last time. So just be aware of how you come across, because if that conversation is repeated, it may not necessarily be the things that you've said that are said, and then you may find yourself in situations that you don't want to be because of a flippant conversation. And also be very mindful, because today the gossip might be about someone else, tomorrow it could be you. So just be careful when it comes to the gossip situation. The next thing we'll talk about is how to define your goals. So you're in a postgraduate training program that is finite. It has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an end. There are exams that you have to pass. There appraisals that you have to go through. So you have to define your goals for each appraisal season. And sometimes that's 6 months, sometimes it's a year. And then you have to define your long-term goals. What do you want to achieve out of this training program? At the end of the training program, what do you want your life, your portfolio to look like? Because that portfolio is what's going to get you your job. And we'll talk about that a bit more. So for me, at the beginning of training, I looked at the age I was when I was getting into training. And I thought to myself, if I'm only doing training and not exploring my interests, then a lot of time will have passed. I'll be older. My training is 6 years. I'll be older. I don't know if I'll be as interested in these things by then. So I need to find a way to balance doing the things I enjoy alongside my training. And this is one of the things I enjoy, sharing my experiences and knowledge with other people. So I thought about that carefully, and I built in a way. So I'll look at my rota and I'll say, okay, I'm off for a few weekends. I can pick one weekend where I can do a huddle, that sort of thing. So it's that way of finding a balance between what you enjoy outside of work and your work. So we've talked a bit about this. So if we go more in depth into it, one of the things I would say is, if you think about the end point, so at the end point, I'm going to CCT as a general surgeon with a special interest. If I'm picking conferences, I'm not going to randomly pick conferences just so I can get an international conference. I'm going to pick conferences that are relevant to my specialty, which is something that is going to be assessed at the point of CCT. When I'm looking for mentors, I'm not going to just look for mentors in different specialties. I'm going to look for mentors whose specialty or whose roots or whose paths are relevant to me. So when I have challenges, those mentors can support me because they've either been through it or they know how to navigate it. If you're thinking about relocating away from the UK, then during your training is when you need to start asking the questions, because you need to know what exams you need. You need to know where you land. Do you complete the training? Do you leave in the middle of the training? If you leave in the middle, in what step does that stand you for when you get to the country you're going to? If you leave at the end, what certifications do you need? You need to start thinking about it early, start talking to people early, because most of the applications tend to be a year or even 2 years in advance of when you start. So you need to think about it early and start planning early. Now, I've talked about niching down in defining goals, because post CCT, when people are looking to employ you, what they'll be interested in is the skills you're bringing to the table. What are you adding? So if you're a GP, what special interest have you got? What experience, what training have you got that they can add to the practice that is something that they don't have between the existing GPs? If you're a hospital specialist, what are you bringing that the others don't have? Or can you increase capacity that they already have? What are those special areas, things that you can bring? And you'll find that there are all kinds of things. You can do something in education, you can do something that is a new technique in your area of specialty, you can be a research person. Like there are all sorts of things that you can bring and add to the table, but the time to think about it is during your training. Now, when it comes to appraisals, I think this is very, very important because it's different from when you're doing the appraisal when you're not in training. And it's also important because if you've never done it before, then you need to understand that this is something you plan for. So the first thing is, when you start your training, right at the beginning, you need to find out what application is used for your training program. You need to set up your account. You need to find out who your supervisors are and build that into the application when you're setting up. Then you have to have a clearly defined plan for what you are meant to achieve in that year. So whatever your training program is, for every year of training, there will be things that you're meant to achieve, and then there'll be checkpoints. So say you're a GP, you're doing GP training, you'll have the point where you have to do your RCA, and then you'll have the point where you have to do your SCA, or the exams that you're doing your GP placement, and there'll be checkpoints for that. You'll have the points at which you have to do your quality improvement project. If you're in medicine, then you know that you have your IMT 1, 2, 3, or what years you're going to go to the hires. If you're not in a run through psychiatry, you know that you have to transition. So you need to be very clear in your mind about what you need for each stage. You need to create a map. And what tends to happen is, after you've heard a talk like me talking at you about these things, you'll have a clearly defined goal, you'll sit up, you'll look at these things, and then somewhere 6 months down the line, life has happened and you've completely forgotten. So what I've found useful is to have accountability partners. And even with the accountability partners, you can slip up. But it's very helpful to have someone there and you say, have you done your this? Have you done your that? And the person says the same to you. And then you're sort of pushing each other and reminding each other to get things sorted. Reflections, that's when you write in your portfolio things that have impacted you and how they've happened. We learned from the Hadiza Bawa case, which was a pediatric trainee that was being blamed when there were problems with a patient, in spite of clear evidence that it was a systemic issue. That reflections can be utilized in a negative way. So you have to learn to use reflections in a way that is helpful for your growth, but isn't detrimental if there are problems down the line. The appraisal outcomes, they range. So what happens is this. So I've talked a bit about the portfolio, but let me go a bit more in depth. So with the portfolio, you have to do work-based assessments. And with the work-based assessments, what your trainers want is to see that you're building the skills that are relevant to your training program. So there'll be a limit, the number of work-based assessments you're expected to produce, annually. But if you leave it till the end, you'll be overwhelmed. So what is useful is to work out what the number you need for a year is, and to break that down into what you need per week. And then every week, try as you might to create some assessments, just so that you can keep it going. If you get to the end of so around the appraisal time, you'll need to have meetings with your educational supervisors. They'll need to set up things so that other appraisers can do reports and things like that. But so you need to stay on top of it, the dates, be reminding them, make sure that everything is going accordingly. Because what you don't want is, because your trainer didn't set something up, then you're getting an outcome that is unsatisfactory and they're having to have another meeting to discuss you. If your appraisal doesn't go to plan and there are problems and they say you have to do some extra time or you need some extra measures or things like that, then what you need to do is key into those mentors, key into communities that you are a part of. And I don't know if I've mentioned that, but make sure you join a community where there are people either in training or people who've finished training who know what you're going through. And then you can, from there, go and find someone to speak with and say that this is what has happened, and then take guidance from there. The worst thing that can happen is for you to have an unsatisfactory outcome and be quiet about it, and then get to the end of your training and you can't complete your training, and then they cite some event from your past appraisal as the reason for that. And this has happened to trainees in the past. There's a popular proverb that goes, closed mouths don't get fed. So this is one of the ways to apply it. If you have a problem and you are quiet, you will not get help. But if you speak up, there are always people who can help, who can direct you, put you in the right direction and support you. So that hopefully should provide some insights into appraisal. We've talked quite a bit about when things go wrong. Silence is your enemy. So speak up, find help, talk to mentors. Your family and friends, if they're non-medics, it can be quite tricky for them to fully understand and guide you. So be wary about taking advice from that direction, because they don't necessarily know, and all they want is for you to be better. So find mentors who are in the system who can guide you, but take succor and find strength, solace from your family and friends. Look inward. There must be something that is triggering the negative experience that you've had. So find where you can also do something different. Look inwards and see, what can I do differently? I don't want to be in this situation again. As easy as it is to externalize it and play the victim, it's not going to serve you. So look at yourself. What can I change? What can I do differently? But also get help, because there is bullying and there's unfair treatment, and to pretend that there isn't is folly. So let's be wise about the way we handle things. And then once you've had that discussion with your mentors, you've got guidance, the next steps, usually you're able to progress without too much of a do. But if you need to get advocates who will speak up for you, who will come and be at the meetings and say that this is not right, sometimes it gets to that point. But don't wait until there's a whole big thing. Get people involved early who can support you. Now, one of the things that is very fascinating to me is when I meet people who kind of get to the end of their training and are like, oh, that went really quickly. I'm not really prepared to be a consultant. It's so fast. And I hope I'm not in that situation, because I always wonder, like, at the beginning of this thing, it's coming to an end. So why are you not planning for the end at the beginning? I remember I went to a training course and I said to someone that it's a CCT requirement, so I wanted to get it sorted. At this point, I was ST4, and the person was like, "Oh, because why am I meant to wait till I'm ST8? No, if I've done it now and it's going to count, then it's out of the way. We check the box." And that's one of the ways to look at it. So you need to start planning very early, know the things you need, start thinking about jobs. So if there are areas that you think you might want to live, visit the areas, see if it's actually nice. Like, do you really want to live there, or is it just an idea? If there look on the jobs website, see what the job market is like in that area. Before you go to interviews, speak with people who have done interviews. There are now companies that help with, especially international medical graduates, but also just in general, they help you prepare for consultant jobs, for salaried GP jobs or partner jobs and things like that. So it's useful to be aware of where help can come from. Think about your job plan or the number of sessions you want to do. Think about whether you'd be happy to start in a locum consultant job, or if you want a substantive post, do you really have a choice, or will you just take what you get? If you're going to be doing private work once you've completed your training, then during your training you need to be thinking about the skills in your specialty that are relevant to private work that you can do safely. I haven't included it, but at the start of your training you should think about getting indemnity for your training, and it usually gets more expensive as you progress in your training. But whilst the trust has some cover for you, it's useful for you to also have some cover for yourself, especially as an international medical graduate. And then this is the point to be thinking about portfolio careers. So quite a few people are starting to work less than full time, and they combine different professions in their areas of interest. Sometimes it's not even different professions, it's just different tracks in the same medical profession. So thinking about that during your training can help you expose yourself to the people or the opportunities that can support you having that sort of career. So it means that you don't have the, I don't want to say monotonous, but the consistent Monday to Friday, same job, regardless of the day of the week, all day, every week. You can have, on Mondays, I do my teaching, on Tuesdays to Wednesdays, I do my hospital work, on Fridays, I do research, that sort of thing. So it's useful to start to think about it, but not only think about it, but speak to people who are doing these things so you understand how they achieved it, what you can do. We had a huddle, I think it's over a year now, the career huddle, and we had an NHS career coach, Mr. Matt Daniel, and he talked extensively about portfolio careers. He shared his own experience. That video is available on YouTube, so you can check the YouTube page if you want to learn more about the basics of how to navigate that.